Well, firstly, we've got to thank our sponsors, Jib. So go and specify heaps of Jib. Get out there. But I'm going to play you a video about Jib, and it'll inspire you to specify more Jib.
Our new Tauranga facility is now operational, manufacturing and distributing Jib plasterboard across the nation, the size of 8 rugby fields, with 50% more capacity than the Auckland plant, and the ability for further expansion. Designed with our commitment to safety, quality, sustainability, and innovation. We will always be on board with you.
So good on Jib. They've been sponsoring this for 15 years, there or thereabouts. So without their support, this wouldn't be happening. Good run to it. Good work, team. Okay, well, Retallack Thompson. This is them here. Jemima Retallack, good run. You did it. And Mitchel Thompson. Started in 2016. Their work is beautifully crafted, deeply connected to place, and attentive to how buildings are made and how they age. I came across a wonderful quote on Instagram that you'd posted of Charles Moore that perfectly captures their architectural approach, and this is Charles Moore. In our practice, we have held to the belief that houses must be special places within places, separately the center of the world for their inhabitants, yet carefully related to the larger place in which they belong. And that's a wonderful description of architecture that is once intimate and grounded in its wider context. So please welcome our guests, Jemima and Mitchel. Thanks a lot.
Kia ora, kutu katoa. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Jemima and I have been traveling recently. We went and saw architecture that we've always looked to, but only ever in photographs. Aalto in Finland, Leverance in Sweden, Utzon in Bergsvad, Sana in Kanazawa. Buildings we thought we knew. What strikes you standing in front of them is how much the photograph conceals. Not just the scale or the light, but the logic. The brick Leverance used in St. Petri, wasn't a special invention. It was common to the supply chain available to him. What we'd read from a distance as an exotic material, as an exotic material choice, was simply what was there. Though, and this is where it gets interesting, the manner in which it was laid was something else entirely. The material was ordinary, what was done with it wasn't. It's made us think about how much we attribute to intention what might be more accurately understood as constraint. When those constraints are invisible to us, we tend to see the result and invent a rationale for it, which shapes, in ways we probably don't fully register, how we learn from buildings we haven't actually been to. We found that when the constraint is well understood and accepted, the focus can then be upon what you can control. Leverance was relieved of choosing which type of brick. It was arguably incidental. And this allowed him to focus upon the architectural purity of laying out a church and community centre in whole bricks with no cuts. The constraint became a relief. We're not quite sure what others think of our Australian architecture. Perhaps it's Merkit's Pavilion in the Bush image, a powerful image, but an image nonetheless. And more importantly, not representative of the mostly urban condition in which architects are engaged. Perhaps many of the things you see as bold architectural freedoms in our work are more architectural stealths or curations. And perhaps the odd is actually a logical, straightforward decision. which is exactly why we are both here and why we're excited to see more of the work of New Zealand architects and to understand more about the images that we've seen of your work and what's really behind them.
So this is where we live and practice, on Gadigal country in inner Sydney. We're right in pretty much the edge of the CBD. Mitchell and I are both born and raised in Sydney, and we do feel a fairly strong pull to our city. We're a very urban environment, not dissimilar to Auckland, but we're very defined by our harbour. Which is why we love this David Moore image from 1969, which sort of disappears the land and sort of shows how the peninsulas are shaped and formed. I think it's what makes our living in Sydney produce a desire to be outdoors as much as we are indoors, and this has a pretty big influence on our work. We sometimes describe ourselves as architects who'd rather design with garden than building. This type of intervention has come from this inherited place that we've grown up in, and also possibly the difficulties that we have with the colonial overlay of buildings that exist here. To reference the quote which Aaron has found, here it is. So it must matter to us. This is by an American architect, Charles Moore, nothing to do with the photographer. But as practitioners, we're interested in pushing for a critical regionalism. We think this is something that's become lost in the age of Instagram and global image digestion. For us, this awareness of our city and our place, we feel should define our buildings in a stronger sense than currently exists. We sometimes describe our projects as referencing a hypercritical regionalism, where we look for contextual cues within our response at not just the city scale, but right down to the street itself or even the neighbouring houses. We consider our projects as being ones of continual adaptation. Most of our projects are located in the inner city and eastern suburbs of Sydney, which means we're usually contending with heritage conservation areas. We're always inheriting various conditions, buildings, architectural spaces, materials, before we even begin to introduce the restrictions of budgets, planning controls, and client briefs, let alone our own agenda. It's very common for our projects to be largely ones of alteration and adaptation, not even necessarily addition. This has been born from quite a pragmatic reality of building in Sydney, but also from our own approach, which sees an importance in maintaining and celebrating the existing fabric of our buildings where it's appropriate. In many ways, this is due to building costs. So when we started practice, we used to work off a 6,000 Australian dollars a square metre, and this is now up at 14,000 a square metre. Sustainability initiatives aside, it's because of this that we have an ethos of concentrating design to the worst and most lacking parts of a project to try to create a multiplying result in terms of the gains in amenity and spatial reconfigurations.
One of our early projects where we first tried to apply some of this thinking was House for a Garden. Our client came to us wanting a garden with a house as a secondary concern. It was probably one of the best briefs we've ever had. A retired professor of science, she lived alone and was looking for somewhere to keep experimenting through the seasons on plants now rather than protein structures. The spatial requirements of the house were simple: a place to sleep, cook, eat, read, and listen to music. She did ask our thoughts prior to the purchase of the property. We advised her to get a site on the high side of the street, freestanding, probably not brick, as we knew the budget was tight, and she did none of those. Like, none of them. So we discovered a site in partial flood zoning, sewer asset across the backyard, damp ground, damp walls made from brick. The existing plan was a familiar inheritance a linear sequence, one room after another. In the bedrooms, the front bedrooms, this is fine. Each room keeps its own door and has privacy, but applied to the living spaces, the same logic turns rooms into corridors. The more living space you provide to the rear, the greater the reduction in amenity. So there were not too many places to go in terms of providing a different aspect to this garden that she wanted. The options available were pretty limited, but the typical options that you would run through always assume that you're adding space. And when we looked at the floor space we had already, we were pretty close to fulfilling the brief. So we thought about like adding a garden somewhere inside, and then we thought about giving a room over to a garden. And then eventually the penny dropped and we just realized that we should just take it further and just remove the worst parts of the house altogether. And so subtracting was the least we could do. The removal of a superfluous inboard dark living space at the rear, outside the existing hipped roof, gave every adjacent room immediate access to light, air, and importantly, a new north-facing garden halfway along the home, of which the cost per square metre was a fraction to build of the other rooms. We'd created a new type of garden space for our client through the simple absence of building. Kitchen, storage, laundry were pulled to the southern party wall to make the floor plate as efficient as possible. It stops short of the rear room due to particular planning control. The move also ensures the living room has unencumbered access to the existing rear garden that was very beautifully designed by Kirsty Kendall, our landscape architect who we work with a bit. And it's been planted and loved and tended to by our client. If you think of the central garden as a room, then the sequence of spaces technically sort of hasn't changed. It takes a particular bravery from a client to give up space, but it was that decision which really sort of made the seismic shift in unlocking the plan. The flooding controls that applied to the site meant that any new construction had to sit 1/2 metre higher than the existing floor level. Existing levels were able to be retained where they were kept. And in order to avoid a costly process with the local council, we sought approval for this project under our state's complying development code. This meant that in order to work with a fairly restricted budget, we had to make use of the existing levels as much as possible. The slightly stealthy retention of the lean-to allowed us to keep the kitchen space at the main living level. We then step up into the lounge room, which is the only portion of the build classified as new. The removal of building to create the central garden meant that existing rooms were now exposed to flood. So we poured a large concrete retaining wall to capture the edge of the garden, which subsequently became a nice place to sit at garden level. And the living room, now raised, straddled the existing low garden to the rear, and a new elevated garden in the central part of the home. The concrete...
Sorry, I'm out of sequence.
Yeah. There we go. Now I'm back. That was the flooding mitigation, the bench. And then this is where the concrete bench reappears, or our flood level bench reappears. Here it's a seat or a place to lay in the sun. It's west facing. A service passage along the north boundary becomes a sort of fourth garden with stepping pavers and dracaena. The established camellias and callistemon in the backyard was retained to get a sense of an established garden space. So sort of different characteristics were imbued in each of the gardens. The flooding control was potentially disastrous to the viability of the project, but when curated, it resulted in each room having a unique engagement with the garden. We have this saying in the office, what's the smallest maneuver you can make to render the greatest effect? In this instance, a subtraction and a little elevation create what we feel to be a rich spatial experience where sunlight and plants are always experienced differently. The same subtractive act is performed at a smaller scale in service of the front east-facing garden. The formerly dark-bricked, high-fronted veranda was reshaped we cut a large crescent into it to let in the morning light and provide a nice space for a cup of tea and to wave to neighbours over the native grasses and the flowering gum. Budget, another constraint, was met by restraint. Uncommon in most projects, but a testament to the trust, again, of our client. The economy in the project is in the economy of demolition. We removed as little as possible, only the rear laundry, and kept the existing floor levels where we could. I think in the end, we built 4 square meters of new floor space. We built only the necessary to keep costs down. Materials followed the same logic, left raw and direct rather than dressed. The exposed timbers are standard pine LVLs, lovingly sanded by our builder, a New Zealander. The stamps removed to celebrate the pine veneer, and the house reads as honest about what it costs to make. But much of the real work was pragmatic, resolving rising damp in the brick portion at the front of the bungalow, running radiant heat throughout and pulling light into previously dark interiors. The new insertions and targeted removals borrow the neighbouring gardens, the dominant tree line and the open sky, framing a set of rooms to occupy within an otherwise suburban surround, a garden sanctuary with a house arranged to serve it. A stone's throw from House for a Garden is another project of ours, Treehouse. And we simply called it Treehouse because there was a 20-metre lemon-scented gum that rose out the back of in the middle of the backyard, visible from all of the surrounding streets, including House for a Garden. It was a natural landmark for the area. Its massive diameter at the ground level shaped how our clients used the yard. It could be seen from nearly every room in the existing house, and it was immediately clear that this connection had to be preserved. Our clients told us that they'd bought the house with the tree and hoped that if they ever sold it, the tree would still be there, so its survival was preferred. So before we drew a single line, we had a rather sublime constraint to operate within. The house was part of a modest remnant row of about 8 workers' cottages in Sydney, clad in timber weatherboard with small DIY additions accumulated over the years, but at a polite scale with gardens that seemed unconcerned about boundaries. The project began with long conversations with the clients as we came to understand their needs and routines, no different from any other project. And we noticed neighbours dropping in for cups of tea and local kids turning up to play. We came to see the project as less about a closed family unit and more about accommodating a kind of village. So the idea of neighbourliness was of great concern for our clients. It mattered a lot. The planning controls would have allowed a full demolition of the house, which, to be honest, was not in the best condition and considered for a second. But rather than an individual gesture in the row, they wanted to stay in harmony with the community. So the front was kept. Their concern for what happens beyond their own boundary was quite a noble starting point. The house itself was rather interesting. The workers' cottage featured the usual paradigm of 2 bedrooms in the front, flanked by a hallway on the side boundary that bled out into a sort of strange officey quasi-space. The site slopes from the street, and someone 40-ish odd years ago thought it would be a great idea to put all the living spaces in a 2.2 metre undercroft below. So that was our spatial constraint. The concept of the village, however, does descend a level of magnitude to the family unit itself. Each occupant had their own busy life at work or differing stages of school. Again, the words of Charles Moore became a guide for the approach. Treat the home as a little village. Everyone can find their own space, but come together as a family as well. In terms of metrics, the current situation was 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom for a family of 5 with 2 dogs. And it was the hardest working house that we'd ever come across. And when we finally started demolition work, it didn't take too much to knock down. The requirement was that everyone needed their own space, an office for the parents, and as Moore states, a space to come together. And all of this had to occur between the retained front bedrooms and the gum tree in the back, the massive gum tree in the back. Formally, the design is simple. The existing pitched roof form is extruded towards the rear, stopping to match the rear alignment with the neighbours. It's within this envelope that we then carve out spaces to construct a street that connect all the new first floor bedrooms. The street is a slatted walkway of sanded LVLs. The openness of the walkway was designed to allow light from skylights over, and that would penetrate all the way down to the lower ground floor. Rooms are carved out of the interior envelope to provide a variety of single, double, or triple height spaces. To improve the height of the lower ground floor, we actually excavated downwards about 800 mil. And this meant that our living areas were sunk into the garden. And when seated on the built-in lounge, you're surrounded by planting and greenery. The doors pull right around to open up fully on the corner. So in summer, you can feel like a shaded undercroft, more than a contained room. The builder was found by the client at the recommendation of the local soccer club parents. And his and his team's main strength was carpentry, which we quickly discovered. Because of this, we embraced this idea of elevating the traditional timber carpentry details of exposed framing and tried to lean directly into their skills. We had vague ideas of what these balustrades and this wall finishes would be, but they sort of became much clearer when we met the builders, when we discovered what they were good at. The project was sort of halfway through construction when COVID hit, and we were suddenly faced with some pretty immediate impacts on material availability and costs. We felt the project survived this moment as it was essentially all on-site carpentry. We weren't reliant on too many externalities or suppliers, joiners, other fabricators, and the works continued throughout the pandemic, 4 guys just chipping away in various corners of the site. We were really pushing for details that sought to celebrate a directness in the building's construction and avoid overly fussy finishes. In an unexpected way, the pandemic proved the efficiency and appropriateness that comes with leaning into material availability and the skills of the available trades. The timber framing of the existing house was left exposed, painted LVLs, fibre cement to distinguish the parts of the house that are left above ground, kitchen bench and upturn of concrete dealing with retention of soil levels. This kept the original hallway as a quiet, we pulled the entry to the house down the side passageway so that you could enter into the dining room and lower ground floor of the house, into the more public areas of the house. And then this kept the original hallway as a quiet, private corridor to avoid the awkwardness of passing messy teenage daughters' rooms. From the backyard, the house becomes a bit creature-like. Steel legs grounding the first floor in the garden. There's a subtle crank in the rear facade to shield the view to the neighbour on the south side, and folds the building to sort of hug or acknowledge the canopy of the lemon-scented gum. The primary bedroom gets large sliders to the room so they can open up almost like a balcony, looking directly at the tree. This is a double layer of glazing and then solid timber hatches to allow for complete darkness for sleeping. It's a fairly tight inner city suburban site, so the house backs and looks onto rear neighbours, but the tree and elevation were able to get either a trunk or canopy outlook into almost every room.
So This is a relatively new project of ours that we're going to talk about next. It's a terrace house in Surrey Hills in inner Sydney again. All of these projects are sort of 15 minutes apart. The terrace house typology is at its most prominent in this area of Sydney. It's very dense, so much so that it was actually subjected to slum clearing in the 30s. Most of the terraces are about 130, 150 years old. Most of them are not well built, and we usually encounter them in various states of disrepair. But despite all this, they're incredibly revered and loved by Sydney-siders. We're personally getting a little bit over them. For our client, their connection to the house was one of nostalgia, being the first house that they ever owned and they started their family in. But 30 years on, the condition needed to be addressed. Because of the heritage conservation area, there's a fairly established or even enforced approach to which exists where the primary expression to the street really has to remain unchanged. There's an understanding in Sydney that the approach to a terrace house will essentially be a mullet, conservative, maintained front, hair down at the back. We had a very typical light touch to the front facade, with new works being what we thought subtly radical. So we shifted the green tone to brighten the facade, we simplified the metalwork, and rather than sort of pretending that we could repair the porcelain tiles that used to be on the front balcony, we replaced them in a cobblestone, which we hoped would be a bit more robust against the historic root ingress from the street tree. The terrace was largely original in terms of its layout. It has the two good rooms, all these houses have two good rooms, to the front with a lean-to kitchen to the back. But in this case, there'd been a historic approval from the 1980s for a very large timber deck at the first floor. As an elevated private open space, this is very unusual, so much so that council spent a very long time checking that it had been legally approved. But in this instance, the inherited condition was advantageous for us. Because of the extensive tree coverage around the site, this deck was very rotten and unsafe, but the amount of open space that it gave the home was incredibly unique, so we didn't want to lose that. Our approach was thus one of proposing repair and replacement, which we knew in reality meant complete replacement, but repair meant that council couldn't mandate its removal. Inheritance is not necessarily restrictive. We often inherit good things in our projects, or at least we seek them out, and we find that these can become important touchstones that we in turn use to drive our own response. There existed a very beautiful steel stair to the timber deck, which had been made by a friend of the owners, and the former materials of this stair really became important to making sense of the replacement of the new deck as a galvanized steel structure. The deck, whilst it gave a really useful sun-filled outdoor space, completely overshadowed the main living areas on the ground floor, and this is why we designed it as a very porous structure. The decking boards are 25mm square hollow sections, which are fairly generously spaced so that the living spaces below get this dappled light from above. Council were quite adamant that the deck should be a like-for-like replacement. And we find this sort of enforced heritage interpretation quite problematic, particularly when we're not necessarily dealing with beautiful or successful things. Maybe you can get from my tone that we encounter this a lot. The previous balustrade was a timber with horizontal wire infill between the posts. And so on the grounds that this is no longer compliant under our building codes today, we sort of hid in the stealth of expanded mesh sounding like an interpretation of wire. The main priority we had with the balustrading was that we wanted it to feel like part of the deck to create an object that would evaporate. And this is something that we'd experimented with in our own house where the mesh disappears. So you become a bit more aware of the form of the deck rather than its volume. In a lot of ways, this project is primarily a fence and a deck. We added 5 square meters to the ground floor at the rear to get the kitchen working with a washroom and laundry space. And because of the invading tree roots from the neighbouring laneway, there actually wasn't a lot of scope to be able to increase the footprint. So we instead took an approach of borrowing width or the sense of width through the laneway and the side passage to get more light into the living spaces without physically building new area. The project is called Row's End because that's exactly what it is. It's at the end of the row, and we found ourselves again with quite a unique condition of being able to open up most of our side boundary to the northern light. The rear and side boundary are all to a gated laneway that's shared by the neighbours, and so we used an off-the-shelf web forge grating to wrap the perimeter of the site. It appears quite dense when you're oblique to it, but then it sort of opens up and is transparent when you're standing directly in front of it. It allowed us to borrow the space but still be resilient and robust to cope with the realities of tree matter and inner city living. I haven't included photos to quite describe the condition that we found this in, but it was sort of dissolving is how I would describe the building. This approach to borrowing width ran through into the treatment of the new rear interior kitchen and living spaces. We maximised corner openings, which again, we've seen a few of already, to capture these typically rare oblique views across the site and living spaces. I think this is about a 5-metre width. We always find when we're dealing with these narrow sites that we're wanting to try to get cross views through spaces. We took an approach of celebrating and exposing the new structural requirements with the steel plate beams and window reveals exposed in the same way that the original terrace and builders would have expressed their window lintels with arching brickwork header courses. We like that there's this sort of appropriated celebration of craftsmanship, which continues from the old to the new works. We inserted a single new opening to get a visual connection between the main dining and kitchen areas to again set up those cross views between rooms. We like compartmentalisation of rooms for living, particularly within terraces where otherwise you risk getting this sort of train carriage over an extended hallway. We've moved on as a culture of divorcing cooking, so we think this is this important balance of bringing the sort of modernisation of these otherwise very Victorian living arrangements. In all, we wanted to make the interventions almost as apparent as possible. All the wet areas are new, and we use the language of the steel structural interventions to frame out the new window openings, joinery pieces, and also dividing walls. We're always looking to maximise space and minimise wall build-ups where we can in terraces, because width isn't at a premium. So we use the 8mm steel plate to act as a wall finish, structure, and joinery in a single move where we can. Many of the elements that we refined in Row's End ultimately came out of a lot of experimentation in our own house, which is Steel House Stone House. On paper, our house could be defined as a family compound. It's owned and built to house 2 families. We initially had our office there as well, and there's a garden courtyard which was used to buffer all of these various uses. This idea of combined living working arrangement was not at the time in 2018 particularly common for Sydney. We had worked in similar setups, though in short working stints overseas, and there exists some alluring precedents, including Pierre Chareau's Maison de Verre. The use of levels and multiple entrances to house doctor's office and family home shows a workable compartmentalisation, which we've mimicked in miniature. The way we structure our work and lives is very much formed by our time living in Berlin, where I worked for a couple who had 5 children, an office of 30 staff, and they did all this while living and working out of a single building in the middle of the city. It showed us a way of life that has worked for us in terms of practice and co-parenting and co-directing a business together. The idea that you could achieve a working living office arrangement in a terrace is possibly on paper a bit of a stretch of an idea. But again, Glenn Murcutt himself actually inhabits something similar in a fairly nondescript, at least from the street, heritage conditions again, semi-detached brick house in a nearby harbour suburb in Sydney. We're millennials, which means we obviously cannot afford a home ourselves. Thus, this compound idea came together to allow us to purchase the property in conjunction with my father and stepmother. They had their own housing problem, living on a farm 4 hours outside Sydney, and they had teenage children attending school and university. So there was a need for 2 homes. The house we purchased was a sandstone cottage dating back to the 1830s, so it's quite old for Sydney. And it had an empty rear yard. The white was sort of the empty bit. The bit attached to it is the stone bit. Historically, there'd actually been a cottage in the rear which had burnt down, and so the site backs onto a rear laneway. When we bought the laneway, primarily had garages onto it, but in the last 10 years, it's sort of transformed largely in a similar nature to what we've done on our own site. We thought the site was perfectly set up for a secondary dwelling arrangement, given all this. It's worth noting that the City of Sydney, which is our local council, has no minimum lot size requirement. So we actually managed to get approval for this as a subdivision. We didn't end up doing that. It's all on one lot because it meant we couldn't do owner-builder if it was a subdivision. And the whole project was basically governed by this sort of rule. Can we afford it? No. Okay, let's not do it. The dwelling is divided in two, with our home on this side in the stone house fronting the main street. We introduced a stair right at the front door and a curtain which could conceal the house to get down to the studio space below. And we ran the office out of here for 5 years and had 2 staff members down there until it just got a bit intense. The back house, the new build on that side, is the steel house. It's a 2-bedroom house with parking off the laneway. There's a decent crossfall on the site, which lets us gain elevation change between the 2 houses, which I think is actually what makes it work. As both architect owners, the construction of this project had to use the resources readily available to us. The only way we could afford to do this project was the fact that we were the architects, so consultant costs were low. And we also knew that we had to do a lot of the physical construction and labouring. My father is a skilled welder, and labour costs being part of it's probably the highest and biggest factor of construction costs in Australia. We leaned into the ready accessibility to this trade heavily. So this is where the steel part comes in. Our house was a case of infilling a piece of roof to pull the rear bathroom into the centre of the house and gain a second bedroom. So this is what it used to look like. We learnt pretty quickly that it was best not to intervene heavily with the stone. The walls are 500 mil thick in part, and it's all Sydney sandstone. We painted areas in part to control the extent of sand which rains down, but also to brighten the sometimes pretty cave-like interior. All the new interventions are timber elements, painted framing, lining boards, in part to work with the character of the original materials, and in part because we actually found we could do this. Lining boards were sort of easy to paint and finish. It's basically a sort of one-to-one basswood model making exercise. We grabbed every available space. So we took out parts of ceilings to expand the roof space into the front room. We grabbed new skylights into the centre so that we could get natural light into those rooms. And we have another little attic room, which is what's up in that window, which is quite low, and it's now inhabited by our very tall 10-year-old. The office, we just cleared the back of the house of all the lean-to plumbing, which instead was relegated down the chimneys. We welded up large hinged doors so the whole elevation at ground could open up to the garden space. Interestingly, this was the one thing my dad refused to take part in. He wanted to do it a particular way. He didn't support the way we wanted to do it, and I don't think he didn't want to lift it. He wanted to do it in Duragal. Anyway, he did not make this one thing. They work. The new house at the rear was designed as something we thought we could build. The main structural frame of the house employed as a steel structure. Window details were resolved with plate steel. Stairs and walls within the new house became steel, which was all shop drawn and ordered, cut ready for site welding. The boundary walls used the original stone party wall on one side. It was there. We didn't have to build it. And on the other side, it was masonry to achieve the required fire rating. Every decision was very pragmatic. When relying on a family member for a skilled trade, the results can be fast and looser than you may accept for a client. It allows, though, for spontaneous shifts and changes. With a material which is usually planned out well before arriving on site, having the makers on site meant that geometries did change, elements were ground and cut as the practicalities of installation came into reality. This project taught us a lot in terms of construction. I think, unfortunately, there is some truth in what you learn as an architect building your own house. So unfortunately, very expensive though. We would shop draw what we could. We had this staircase cut and bent. And again, it was a space-saving exercise in avoiding stringers and having a site welder available. This makes our thinnest wall 10 millimeters to counter the 500 millimeter walls of the stone house.
6.
That was 6?
Yeah.
I feel like that was my dad again saying he wasn't going to lift 10. Yeah. The last element of the project, the idea was that the stair would become this sort of white painted element at the center of the house, which would just bounce light down from a rather large skylight above. The last element of the project was the construction. There's Dad. Look, he's even doing The last element of the project was the construction of a steel deck appended to the rear of the existing stone house. Envisaged as a diaphanous structure, its transparency was important given that our studio was below it, and so we were going to spend a lot of time looking at its underside. This is where we tested what a steel decking might look like, and we trialed everything from perforated sheets to agricultural expanded mesh. In the end, this was the first use of the square hollow sections, and actually we used our furniture to gauge exactly how wide we could go before the chairs would fall through. We drew the shape of this and had it bent, but all this was chopped and tweaked. It was very much a feel-it-out process, which is only possible when you're doing something yourself. The last iteration of this deck at Rose End was completely shop-drawn and it used bolted connections. It's a do as I say, not what I do. It's still an important ethos in architecture. A folded steel plate stair is tacked onto this deck. We asked the engineer how much support this might need. We ignored him at first, and the whole structure had a bit of a wobble, but it was quickly remedied with a small connection back to the wall of the original house. The garden space, which is actually one of the only mandated areas from council, which is you have to have 16 square metre per dwelling, was used to buffer all these different activities on the site. We maintained the existing garden level at the centre, so it's actually raised in part. And this meant when we're sitting in the lower ground office, we weren't staring into the dining room of my sister's house. When you're up on the deck and living room, we in turn look into the canopy of a newly planted tree. And the first floor of the secondary dwelling deliberately was left fairly blank to ensure privacy. We were maybe selfishly quite conscious that we would be looking at this facade. And so we spent a long time working out what it should be. Because we were trying to be cost efficient, we kept it lightweight. It's a lightweight infill to the steel structure. And in the end, we built ourselves a pleated facade, which were hand sanded, unequal angles, which was essentially a rain screen to a very pragmatic painted villa board cladding behind. The intention was that it would become a sort of evaporative mirror and just reflect the sky and the changing light. We quite like aluminium as a sanded finish because it sort of has that sort of zinc-like quality. In a moment of concern about reflectivity, we decided that we'd use unequal angles so that we could put the longer edge to the south and the shorter edge to the north. I'm not sure if it actually did anything. Yeah, we thought we'd end away from our usual urban setting, a rural site this time, but the same encountering of inheritance and necessary intervention and a demonstration of approach. The idea was to create a house in an old agricultural building. These structures, which are dotted around the farms of Australia, and they're likely pretty similar in New Zealand, are beautiful to us in how direct they are. In their necessity. Hardwood timbers, undressed, still showing the size of the tree as they were when they were fell, with simple veils of corrugated iron. For us, this sort of project exemplifies the idea of how little one should intervene. Although not to code, we fundamentally have a structure. The idea of transformation to a home is really about a division of space to reflect the differing functions that are now required and improving or actually creating a protective skin. A structurally insulated panel clad the outside, a new skin to the old bones, effectively independent of the timber frame. We considered the idea of enveloping such a building as a way to use what we inherited. Whilst wonderfully remote, this is not so wonderful for trades and materials. So we looked at what materials and makers were readily available, namely agricultural steel sections. I think we must have listened to Dad because we were looking at Duragal. Whilst this refinished product doesn't allow for much variety in sizes compared to standard steel profiles, we embraced the oversized nature of the profiles to work with what they make. This felt commensurate with the ruggedness of the place and realistic in terms of who would be constructing this. The windows and doors were not made with purposely extruded aluminium sections. Instead, like our back doors, we used RHS steel sections in a factory with welders that usually fabricate sheep runs and fencing. It was a deliberate choice to work with materials that they would know. To come back to what we saw in Leverance, the brick choice itself was almost predetermined. What was done with it wasn't. What we inherit, the fabric, the budget, the controls, the builders and trades who happen to be available, is not necessarily the obstacle, but actually part of the work itself. This is our approach. It's not particularly novel or inventive, but for us it feels appropriate. We think appropriateness is what allows us to work honestly, to make houses which belong to their place. They belong to our city, our neighbourhoods, and ultimately they belong to our clients who live in them. That's perfectly timed because my battery is about to die. Thank you very much.